The wind comes before the storm. It moves low across the tundra, unobstructed by trees or hills, carrying ice crystals that strip exposed skin in seconds. The temperature is minus 50 degrees Celsius. No sun has risen in weeks. Across the treeless expanse of northern Fennoscandia, a family is making camp. They are not searching for a cave or building a wall. One person lifts 3 birch poles, locks their notched tips together in the air, and spreads the base. The frame stands without stakes, without ropes. Within minutes, the rest of the poles lean into the crown. Reindeer hides are unlaced and stretched over the structure, hair side in, overlapping at the edges. A gap is left at the peak. A smaller gap remains at the ground. Fire is lit at the center. The blizzard arrives. The tent does not move. This is the Lavvu, refined across thousands of years to solve a specific, lethal problem. How to stay alive in a climate that kills in minutes, while never staying in one place long, enough for the cold to find a permanent advantage. The Sami people have lived across the northern territories of modern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and the Kola Peninsula of Russia for over 10,000 years. Archaeologists trace human presence in this region back to the immediate aftermath of the last ice age, when populations tracked game across a landscape still recovering from glaciation. Over millennia, as the climate settled into its current Arctic pattern, the people who would become the Sami developed a survival strategy built entirely around a single animal, the semi-domesticated reindeer, Rangifer tarandus. The reindeer did not simply provide food, it defined the terms of existence. A reindeer herd cannot graze a single location through winter. The animals eat lichen, which grows slowly and is depleted quickly beneath their hooves. A herd remaining in place for too long exhausts its food supply and begins to die. The people herding them must follow. A family that built a permanent, heavy, immovable home would be choosing starvation within a single season. The landscape itself enforced nomadism, and nomadism demanded a shelter that could be carried across hundreds of kilometers of frozen tundra, erected in storm conditions, and struck in minutes when the herd moved on. The Lavvu is the direct architectural consequence of that constraint. The Sami understood their environment through an 8-season calendar, far more granular than the 4-season model of temperate regions, because the Arctic's biological rhythms demanded that precision. The most punishing of these seasons is Dalve, deep winter, stretching from December into March. During Dalve, the sun does not clear the horizon. The only light is starlight on snow. Temperatures reach minus 50 degrees Celsius with regularity, and wind accelerates across the flat, treeless tundra without resistance. To survive this period, the reindeer must be guided to sheltered inland areas where snow accumulation is loose enough for them to dig through and reach the lichen underneath. Those sheltered areas shift. The family follows. Construction of the Lavvu begins with 3 birch poles. Birch is the tree that grows closest to the Arctic tree line. The last species standing before the terrain becomes pure tundra. The Sami harvested poles from these northern birch stands, selecting for straight shafts with naturally forked or deliberately notched tips. These 3 primary poles are raised and interlocked at their crowns, their notches meshing together so that the downward pressure of each pole reinforces the grip of the others. The resulting tripod is structurally self-contained. No external force holds it. The geometry does. Once that tripod is locked, 12 to 15 additional straight poles are leaned against the apex in a radial configuration, resting inside the fork of the primary frame. Each pole added increases the load pressing inward and downward, tightening the crown rather than loosening it. The completed frame requires no guy wires, no stakes, no anchors driven into frozen ground. A single person can raise it. In conditions where a sudden blizzard offers minutes rather than hours, that speed is not a convenience. It is the difference between shelter and exposure. The aerodynamic profile of the Lavvu was not an aesthetic choice. The structure sits lower and wider than a casual observer might expect. Its height-to-base ratio is deliberately squat. This geometry addresses the primary mechanical threat of the open tundra. Not weight, not cold, but wind. Wind striking a tall, steep-sided structure creates lift and lateral force. Wind flowing over the Lavvu's low, convex profile is deflected up and over, pressing the structure downward rather than pushing it sideways. The tundra Sami operated in extreme, sustained winds that made taller shelters impossible. The Lavvu's proportions are a calibrated response to that specific environmental force. It has no external smoke flaps. Those are the adjustable panels seen on some other conical tents in different climates. In the winds of the Scandinavian tundra, extended flaps would behave like sails, generating the lateral forces the Lavvu's geometry was specifically designed to eliminate. Instead, the Lavvu manages smoke through physics alone. At the center of the structure burns the aron, the hearth. The fire heats the air immediately surrounding it. That heated air, now less dense than the cold air above, rises in a column toward the open hole at the apex of the tent. As it exits, it creates a zone of lower pressure at the base of the structure. Cold air from outside is drawn in through a slight, intentional gap left at the ground-level edge of the hides, or through the partially open entrance. This fresh air feeds the fire, which heats more air, which rises and exits, drawing in more cold air behind it. The loop is continuous and self-sustaining. The result is an interior free of smoke. The rising column carries combustion gases directly to the apex without pooling at human level. Simultaneously, the thermal column acts as a pressure barrier. The dense, heavy exterior air cannot drop through the smoke hole against the outward pressure of the rising warm air. The tent interior at resting height maintains a survivable temperature, while the polar night outside holds at -50. The floor solves the other half of the cold problem. Air temperature in the Lavvu can be managed by fire, but the ground beneath a tent on Arctic tundra or packed snow conducts heat out of the body faster than the air conducts it in. A person sleeping directly on the permafrost would lose core temperature regardless of the ambient warmth above. The Sami layered the floor with freshly cut birch branches first, creating a raised lattice that separates the body from direct contact with the ground. Over that lattice, heavy reindeer furs were laid hair side up, providing a thick, insulating surface. The birch layer below prevents ground moisture from rising. The fur layer above traps a thermal pocket at body level. Many Lavvu setups also incorporated an inner tent structure called a rakas, a secondary lining hung inside the main frame. This inner layer trapped a dead air buffer between itself and the outer hide covering, reducing the rate at which heat moved through the tent wall. It also prevented moisture from human breath and cooking from condensing on the interior surface of the hides and dripping back as ice. The cover material itself was the product of a biological coincidence exploited with precision. Reindeer hair is structurally hollow. Under magnification, each strand is a tube, not a solid fiber. Insulating air is trapped not only between densely packed hairs, but inside each individual strand. The physics of this structure makes reindeer hide a more effective cold barrier than most contemporary understanding of natural materials would suggest. The trapped, static air inside those microscopic tubes resists conductive heat transfer. When multiple hides are sewn together, hair side, inward, each layer functions as an array of millions of sealed insulating chambers pressed against the interior air. Those hides were sewn using needles made from bone and thread processed from reindeer sinew. Sinew-sewn seams do not gap or split under cold. The thread contracts and tightens in low temperatures, drawing the seam closed rather than loosening it. The choice of sinew over plant fibers was not incidental. In an environment where every seam in a tent cover was a potential heat leak, thread that responded to cold by sealing rather than shrinking away was the correct material. As the 19th and 20th centuries introduced mass-produced European canvas to northern Scandinavia, Sami families gradually shifted the tent cover material from hide to canvas, and later to synthetic fabrics. Canvas was lighter and easier to transport. The introduction of the portable cast iron stove in the 20th century replaced the open aran in many practical setups, reducing fuel requirements and simplifying heat management. But neither of these transitions altered the underlying geometry or airflow mechanics of the Lavvu. The tripod frame, the squat aerodynamic profile, the convective smoke hole system, all of those elements remained because they addressed physical problems that material substitution could not eliminate. The reindeer's contribution to Sami survival did not stop at hide and thread. The animal was the entire resource base. Its meat and organs provided the dense protein and fat required when no agriculture was possible, and gathered plant foods were buried under meters of snow. Its blood was cooked into thick, caloric gruels. Its milk, rich in fat, was processed into cheese. Its bones and antlers were carved into needles, scrapers, and specialized tools. Its sinew sewed the garments and the shelter. The reindeer was simultaneously the reason for the nomadic lifestyle and the primary material source for every system that made that lifestyle survivable. The zero-waste logic of this economy was not philosophy. It was arithmetic. In an environment with no surplus, losing any recoverable material from a slaughtered animal represented a caloric or functional deficit that could not be replaced until the next hunt. The Sami processed everything. The fuel burning in the aran was subject to the same precision. In the Arctic, dry wood is rarer than it seems. Dead birch beneath its waterproof bark tends to rot rather than dry, making it a poor fuel source despite its apparent availability. The Sami burned freshly cut, raw birch, which burns intensely when properly ignited despite its moisture content, producing immediate heat and light. Above the tree line, where birch gives way to low-lying tundra vegetation, they relied on willow, specifically the slow-burning, long-coaling willow that retained heat in its embers for hours after active flame died. In the most extreme cold, when a full lavu could not be established, herders built a large willow fire, let it burn to coals, covered those coals with a dense layer of freshly cut green twigs, and slept on top of the insulating bed while buried heat bled upward through the night. Wood selection for food smoking was equally exacting. Ethnobotanical records from Sami communities document a preference for willow over birch when smoking reindeer meat. Modern chemical analysis of these two combustion processes has confirmed the reasoning. Smoking meat over birch produces polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons at concentrations that exceed current safety thresholds. Willow smoke keeps those compounds well below the toxicity line. The distinction mattered because smoked reindeer meat was not a seasonal delicacy. It was a primary preserved food supply for travel in deep winter, consumed over weeks and months. Exposure to unsafe smoke residues at that frequency and quantity would have carried serious cumulative health consequences. The Sami arrived at the safer choice through direct observation of long-term health outcomes and transmitted it as knowledge across generations. Modern laboratory equipment confirmed what sustained empirical observation had already established. The thermal management system of the Lavvu extended beyond the structure itself. It incorporated the clothing worn inside and outside it as coordinated layers. At -50 degrees, exposed skin freezes in under 2 minutes. The transition from Lavvu interior to open tundra and back required a clothing system that managed that thermal gradient without failure. The outer garment was the biaska, a heavy coat made entirely from reindeer fur, worn with the hair facing outward. The hollow hair insulation that made the tent covering effective applied identically to garment construction. Worn hair side out, the biaska shed wind and trapped a boundary layer of warm air against the wearer's body. Over the biaska went the lukka, a hooded poncho woven from thick wadmal wool. The lukka's function was mechanical protection of the fur beneath it. Reindeer hollow hairs insulate by trapping air inside their structure. Hair saturated with meltwater collapses. The luka shed falling or blowing snow before it could melt against the biaska's fur, preserving the insulative structure of the garment underneath. Footwear was constructed from the toughest sections of reindeer hide, typically from the animal's legs or forehead, where the skin is densest. Inside these boots, called gapmagat or galahat, the Sami packed dried sennegrass, known in Scandinavian languages as shoe-hay. Wool socks were less effective in this context because wool, once damp with sweat, loses much of its insulating capacity and holds moisture against the skin. Dried sennegrass wickeded moisture away from the foot and preserved the thermal pocket inside the boot, even as perspiration accumulated. A wet foot in -50 degrees proceeds toward frostbite within an hour. Sennegrass delayed that process indefinitely when maintained correctly. When a herder returned from hours in the open and entered the Lavvu through its front door, the sequence of actions that followed was thermal system maintenance. The luka was beaten to dislodge snow before it could melt into the biaska. The boots were opened and the sennegrass removed, separated, and placed near the aran to dry. Core body temperature, reduced by prolonged cold exposure, was restored from the inside through the consumption of bidos, a hot reindeer stew dense with fat and protein. The shelter was the recovery mechanism of the larger system, the zone where the body could return to operational temperature before the next period of cold exposure. The Lavvu also functioned as the cosmological center of Sami existence. In traditional pre-Christian Sami animism, the physical world and the spiritual world were not separate domains. Every major action, from lighting the fire to butchering an animal, carried spiritual dimension. The interior of the Lavvu was divided into zones that mapped that cosmology onto the immediate living space with strict spatial rules. The aran, the central hearth, was the residence of Saraka, the goddess of fertility and childbirth. Her name connects etymologically to the Sami word for splitting. Childbirth rituals were performed at the hearth. A piece of wood was ceremonially split to symbolize the opening of the birth canal, and the split pieces became sacred objects no one was permitted to handle afterward. Offerings of meat, cheese, and water were placed directly into the fire before a birth, and following a successful delivery, a communal porridge was prepared and consumed as a ritual acknowledgement. The warmest, most central location in the shelter was also its spiritual nexus, the site where new human life was formally received into the world. The entrance and the area immediately flanking it were the domain of Uksaka, the doorwoman, guardian of the threshold, and protector of infants learning to walk. Women sat in this forward zone to conduct the domestic labor that kept the camp functional, processing sinew into thread, sewing hides, weaving, preparing daily meals. Essential but utilitarian items, the daily firewood supply and the camp dogs, were kept just inside the entrance where the temperature was lowest and the cold air draft from the door most pronounced. The rear of the Lavvu, directly opposite the entrance, was the boasho, the sacred back zone, exclusively male. Here men sat, kept their weapons, and stored the no-aid drums used by the shamans of the community to communicate with the spirit world, locate game, and divine the locations of reindeer, herds in whiteout conditions. The boasho had its own separate entry flap, used to move objects that were spiritually incompatible with the front door. Fresh, unbutchered meat, the raw spoils of the hunt, came in through the back. When someone died inside the Lavvu, the body was carried out through the back door, taking either through the front entrance, governed by Uksaka and the forces of birth and domestic life, was considered to invite catastrophic spiritual contamination of the living space. The most elaborate application of these spatial rules involved the bear. In traditional Sami belief, the bear was not simply large prey. It held the status of a sacred ancestor, a being believed to have descended from the sky. Killing a bear was a spiritual ordeal structured across 7 formal ritual stages, beginning with tracking guided by shamanic divination and ending with prescribed purification rites that lasted days. When a hunting party brought a bear carcass back to camp, the hide and meat entered exclusively through the boisseau. Women were required to avoid direct sight of the hide during initial ceremonies, instead wearing blindfolds and shooting arrows toward the stretched skin as a ritual of controlled engagement with its power. The bear's bones were then carefully placed in a tree or buried to allow its spirit to return to the sky. These ritual structures did real behavioral work inside a confined space. A family or small group spending months in continuous proximity under extreme physical stress, with lethal cold immediately outside, required strong social organization and conflict management. The spatial rules of the Lavvu assigned every person a defined position and role. They separated activities by category: the domestic from the wild, birth from death, female from male. They located the most dangerous and spiritually charged activities at the margins of the space and the nurturing center at the heart. The cosmological map drawn onto the Lavvu's interior provided a framework for daily life that reduced ambiguity and maintained psychological structure through the polar night. Migration dissolved the camp efficiently. When the reindeer herd depleted the local lichen and the family needed to move, the Lavvu's design accommodated the logistics without waste. The hides were unlaced from the poles, folded, rolled, and loaded onto pulks. The shallow, boat-shaped wooden sledges pulled by harnessed reindeer. The poles, being long and cumbersome and not required as cargo space, were bundled and tied directly to the harness rigging of transport animals, which dragged them across the snow to the next site. Castrated male reindeer were selected and trained for this work over time, developed into reliable draft animals through an ongoing exchange of labor and supplemental feeding. The entire architectural footprint of a family's camp could be relocated by a small number of animals. A structure that in its assembled form provided total protection from the most extreme climate in Fennoscandia could, when broken down, be carried across open tundra by the same species that had necessitated its design. There was no separation between the shelter system and the herding economy. The route the reindeer walked determined where the Lavvu rose next. The speed at which the herd depleted its pasture determined how quickly the camp had to move. Every design decision in the Lavvu, from the weight of the poles to the way the hides folded to the absence of stakes that would need to be pried from frozen ground, was downstream of that single unbroken pressure. The Lavvu and the reindeer were components of a single integrated system. Neither made sense without the other. None of these solutions were derived from outside tradition or borrowed from neighboring cultures. They emerged from direct, consequence-based engagement with one of the most demanding thermal environments on the planet, over a period measured in thousands of years. The physics involved is real. The convective pressure differential at the smoke hole is a measurable fluid dynamics phenomenon. The insulative capacity of hollow reindeer hair can be quantified. The thermal conductivity of permafrost against an uninsulated body can be calculated. The Sami reached functional mastery of all of these without the language of physics, by observing outcomes and refining practice until the margin for error disappeared. The Lavvu survived the introduction of canvas, the cast iron stove, snowmobiles, and permanent housing. During the Alta Dam conflicts of the late 1970s and 1980s, when the Norwegian government proposed flooding a Sami river valley to build a hydroelectric dam, Sami protesters erected lavvus outside the Norwegian parliament in Oslo. The structure that for millennia had meant survival in the field became a political statement. This is where we come from, and we are still here. The Norwegian Sami Parliament building, completed in 2005, draws its roofline from the Lavvu's silhouette. The form endures because the logic that created it does not expire. A structure that solves wind, cold, moisture, condensation, smoke, and weight using only geometry, convective physics, and locally available organic material is not made obsolete by the existence of synthetic alternatives. It is proof. The most sophisticated response to the harshest conditions human beings have ever inhabited was not a massive, permanent fortress of stone and mortar, but a portable cone of birch poles and animal hide that one person could raise alone, in a blizzard, in minutes. The Sami did not outlast the Arctic by resisting it. They read it precisely enough to move with it, and built light enough to carry everything they needed to survive.